Volcanoes are scary, but super eruptions might be even scarier because they have the power to not only burn down our planet, but freeze it. And no, I'm not talking about an ice age, which is a natural climate cycle that we've been having for over 2 million years. I'm talking about something much more sudden and extreme, like what happened 74,000 years ago when Mount Toba in Indonesia erupted with such force that it wiped out almost all life on Earth. But just how could a volcano do that? It's complicated, but it starts with the ash. When a volcano erupts, it sends tons of ash and gas into the atmosphere. This ash contains sulfuric acid, which reacts with water vapor in the air to make even more acid. These acids then combine with other compounds in the atmosphere to form tiny particles called aerosols. Aerosols reflect sunlight away from the Earth, so there's less energy left over to warm the planet. So if a volcano eruption is big enough, it can cause a volcanic winter, a period of global cooling. But that doesn't mean it'll start snowing. Instead, temperatures will drop by several degrees, and it will start raining a lot more. Since Earth's surface won't be able to absorb much of the sun's energy, heat will radiate back into space and the temperature of the lower atmosphere will drop. And don't think you can just hibernate through a volcanic winter. No, those extra rains will wash away nutrients from the soil, which will lead to widespread crop failures. And since meat will be hard to come by thanks to all the dead animals who were too stupid to realize the end was nigh, starvation will be widespread. In short, it'll suck. And while you might think this sounds pretty unlikely, it's actually happened a few times throughout history. But none of them compare to what would happen if Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted today. Tambora is one of the most dangerous volcanoes on Earth. The last time it erupted was in 1815, and it remains the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. If it happened today, millions of people would die. Ash would cover entire countries, and crops would fail around the world. In fact, scientists estimate that Tambora has a 10% chance of having a massive eruption in the next 300 years, and if it does, we better be prepared. That's because Tambora is a stratovolcano, which means it's made of alternating layers of lava and ash. It also means that Tambora tends to have very explosive eruptions. If Tambora had a large eruption today, ash would rain down over Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Japan. It would also spread across the Pacific Ocean and affect countries as far away as Chile, Argentina, and New Zealand. Some of the ash would make it even further, eventually covering the entire North American continent. Once the initial blast happens, a massive tsunami would sweep across the Indian Ocean, hitting places like Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and East Africa. Another tsunami would hit the western coast of South America. But what really makes Tambora different from other volcanoes is its caldera. That's a giant crater that forms when a volcano erupts and empties its magma chamber. When Tambora erupted in 1815, its caldera was filled with rainwater, which caused it to collapse and form a massive tsunami that may have reached as far as Antarctica. If Tambora erupted again today, its caldera would likely be filled with even more water, leading to another mega-tsunami. But how high would those waves get? Well, it depends on how much water is in the caldera. If it's half full, the wave heights could be between 10 and 30 meters high. But if the caldera is completely full, we're looking at waves that are over 100 meters high. For some context, the biggest tsunami ever recorded was 30 meters high. All this destruction would be bad enough on its own. But that's before we consider the effects of a volcanic winter. See, Tambora is so big that it has the potential to block out the sun. If it spewed enough ash into the atmosphere, it could cause a volcanic winter that lasts for months or even years. Crops would fail worldwide, and temperatures could drop by several degrees. So to see what would happen, researchers used a climate model to simulate a massive eruption. They found that even if the eruption wasn't super explosive and didn't send a lot of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, temperatures would still drop by several degrees for up to 2 years. The northern hemisphere would be particularly hard hit during summer, which is unfortunate because that's when the planet is usually at its warmest and when crops are actively growing. But what if Tambora had a truly super eruption? You know, one that blasts a whole bunch of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. A 1983 study estimated that Tambora could release anywhere from 10 to 15 trillion grams of sulfur dioxide. And if that happened, things would get really bad, really fast. researchers found that global temperatures would drop by 7 degrees Celsius and precipitation would increase by 15%. The resulting volcanic winter would last between 5 and 10 years. But here's the weird part. After the initial blast, there would be a period of global warming. So, right after Tambora erupted, temperatures would actually go up by a couple of degrees. This is probably because of all the heat that's released when the volcano blows its top. But those higher temperatures would only last a few months before being replaced by a decade of winter. And to make matters worse, there's no way to predict when it will happen. That's why scientists keep such a close eye on the volcano. They monitor seismic activity, gas emissions, and ground deformation to try and figure out when it might blow. There are even webcams set up to look for signs of unrest. So if Tambora were to erupt tomorrow, at least we'd be ready. Right now, there are no major signs of unrest. In fact, Tambora hasn't shown any signs of waking up since 1967. But that doesn't mean it won't erupt soon. It could blow tomorrow or in 100 years. The thing with volcanoes is that you never know. But while Tambora is the largest volcano on Earth, it's not the only one that could cause a volcanic winter. Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines also had a massive eruption in 1991, sending 7 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. And that caused temperatures to drop by 0.5 degrees Celsius, which might not sound like much. But it's significant considering that we're talking about the average temperature of the entire planet. Pinatubo also caused 847 people to lose their lives and more than 100,000 to leave their homes. So what would happen if something similar happened today? Well, unfortunately, Pinatubo is overdue for a major eruption. Since the 1991 eruption, the pressure inside the volcano has been building up and the magma chamber has been getting bigger. Plus, there are signs that it might erupt soon. In 2021, the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology reported increased unrest, including more earthquakes and gas emissions. On top of that, Pinatubo had a small eruption in January of 2022, and while it didn't make international headlines, it was still a reminder that the volcano isn't done with us yet. The good news is that, unlike Tambora, Pinatubo is closely monitored. Scientists have been watching it for decades and they're ready to give people a warning if it shows any signs of waking up. Unfortunately, it's a bit harder to predict how volcanoes will behave. Unlike earthquakes, which follow relatively predictable patterns, volcanic eruptions are more complicated. They depend on factors like the type of magma, the shape of the volcano, and the amount of gas inside. So predicting when a volcano will erupt and how big the eruption will be is really hard. And on top of that, we tend to focus on short-term forecasts, which can be accurate. But long-term forecasts are more difficult. For example, there are different ways to measure the size of an eruption. And instead of trying to predict how tall the ash cloud will be or how many cubic kilometers of material will be ejected, scientists focus on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI. This index estimates the magnitude of an eruption based on the height of the ash plume, the volume of material ejected, and other factors. So when scientists say that a volcano is overdue for a major eruption, they're using the VEI. They're not trying to predict when the next eruption will happen or how big it will be. Plus, even though scientists have been monitoring Pinatubo for decades, they're still not sure how big its next eruption will be. Some researchers think it'll be small, while others think it could be a repeat of 1991. And here's the crazy part. It doesn't really matter whether it's a small eruption or a big one. Any eruption will release sulfur dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, causing global temperatures to drop. And while we know that Pinatubo is overdue for a major eruption, we don't know when it will happen. It could be tomorrow or in 100 years, and that uncertainty makes it hard to prepare. We know that the impact of Pinatubo or Tambora would be felt worldwide, but we don't know how bad it will get. There are a lot of variables at play, like how strong the eruption is, how much sulfur dioxide is released, and how the atmosphere and ocean currents react. Plus, we have to remember that these simulations are just models. They're based on past events and current data. But volcanoes are unpredictable and every eruption is different, so we may never know exactly what will happen until it happens. But even though we can't predict the future, we can prepare for it. By studying past eruptions and running simulations, we can get a sense of what might happen. And by working together, we can try to mitigate the damage. Because let's face it, the last thing we need right now is another disaster to worry about. Volcanic eruptions send tons of ash and gas into the atmosphere. Sulfuric acids form aerosols that scatter and reflect sunlight, cooling the planet. Scientists track sulfur dioxide, SO2, from eruptions using gas sensors and monitoring platforms to estimate atmospheric impact. A caldera collapse could trigger mega-tsunamis across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, striking Southeast Asia, East Africa, and South America, with waves from 10 to 30 meters up to 100 plus meters. Tambora's caldera, the crater left when the magma chamber empties, can fill with water. Higher water levels increase collapse risk and the size of resulting tsunamis. Integrated monitoring, seismicity, gas emissions, ground deformation, and webcams gives scientists early warning signs of unrest at volcanoes like Tambora.